We are about to begin our political panel, which Steve Odland once described as the dessert of the conference. One year it actually almost became a food fight, which would have been CED's very first food fight in the 75 years we've been together. But in any event, we are pleased to ask our panelists to join us. And they need to join us now. Moderating our conversation today is Michelle Cottle, and Michelle is the chief political editorial writer at the New York Times, and she's been covering Washington and national politics since the Clinton administration. And prior to joining the New York Times, she was contributing for the Atlantic, and before that she was a senior writer at the National Journal. I had written in my remarks that Michelle has never said no to us in the maybe dozen or half dozen of these political panels. She has said yes right away, and 2 minutes ago I looked up and she wasn't here, so I was going to strike that from my remarks, but actually I kept it in because I knew Michelle would be here, and she's always been so good about talking to this group and kind of setting the stage for what has always been a stimulating conversation. Joining Michelle is Jeanne Card. She's from Jeanne Card, Inc. Jeanne Cummings is an old friend, Deputy Washington Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. We have Jody Hoffman and Bob Walker, both from Wexler and Walker. And thank you so much for being here.
All right, thank you. For those who have sat through this panel before, you know it can get a little rowdy. I expect nothing less after the midterm we have just been through. So write your questions down and figure out kind of what you want to grill people about later. But my job starting off is I want to just hear from you in terms of, was there anything that surprised you coming out of Tuesday? So let's just go down the road here.
It looks like you'd like me to start.
I'd love you to start.
To me, to put it very succinctly, we live in a divided country, and now we have a divided government. I think it's as simple as that. So in that sense, it is not surprising. I am on the Republican side of the aisle, and I had hoped to hang on to the House, but I didn't find the results surprising. And again, I think that Washington is a reflection of the country.
Anything surprising?
So I think that I'm a Democrat, and I was surprised that the Democrats have at this point pulled through as strongly as they have. I was actually expecting a more tepid election for Democrats, despite some of the predictions of waves. My reading of the polls was it was going to be tepid, and this has been a stronger outcome than I expected.
And Jeanne.
I think I was surprised that there were no surprises. I mean, the midterm is very important in terms of what it says about 2020. What does it say about what's happening in Texas? What does it say about what's happening in Georgia? What happened to the destruction of the Democratic blue wall in the Midwest? Well, that was yesterday's news. So there's a lot for us to analyze and think about in this election, but with all of the hype about Beto and the races in Georgia and in Florida, that none of them may ultimately come true, kind of surprised me. I thought at least one might pop.
I don't want to leave you out, Bob.
Well, I do a lot of my calculations about national politics out of my home state of Pennsylvania, and I thought it was going to be close enough in Pennsylvania that the Republicans would have an opportunity to hang on to the House by 1 or 2 votes. As it turns out, the Democrats did much better than that, in large part because of the suburban vote. And we saw some of that play itself out in Pennsylvania as well. I think my surprise is that the Democrats are as strong as they're going to be in the House, because election night I said that what the outcome looked like to me was that the Senate became more manageable and the House became unmanageable. And I say that from the standpoint that if you had a very narrow margin in the House, you would have only a 1-vote majority on most committees, which makes it very, very difficult to move very much in the committee structure. Now the Democrats are spreading out the numbers enough that they can probably do a 2-vote majority on most committees, and that will make it far easier for them to manage than they were looked like they were going to be able to do.
Now, Jeanne, we were, as Bob pointed out, we have a split House now. The Democrats have been waiting for a long time to get a little bit of power back. What do you see as the dangers lurking for them going forward, whether in terms of overreach or whatever?
Well, there's definitely the question of overreach, but the Democratic caucus came, and the Democratic Party writ large has its own internal tug of war that's got to play out. And Republicans for a long time had the Civil War going on. Right now, when you look in polls, 67% of Republicans declare themselves conservative. If you look at the polls of the Democratic Party, you still have around 40% who say they're moderate. And then you have a rising number of those who say they're liberal. So the Democrats are just starting a fight that the Republicans have had for the last 10 years. And Trump accelerated that fight and, kind of settled it. And we see that with the end of, Republican presence in the Northeast, in California, in the suburbs. It's a very much a changing party in a direction that it's been going for about 10 years. The Democrats are 2 years into that process. And so what do you do with a party where, you have 2 new Democratic House members out of Kansas, a fairly new senator out of Alabama, and add that, to some of the the young new members who are really chomping at the bit to do something differently. And then I heard Congresswoman Debbie Dingell on the radio this week talking about some of the calls that she was getting in her office from her constituents. She had given an interview where she talked about maybe working with the president on infrastructure or some other kind of legislation that they might be able to come to terms with. And the voter called and left her a message and said, I didn't help elect you to get things done. I helped elect you to resist. So they're getting very conflicting messages from their constituents as well.
Now, do you think that the midterm has helped clarify at all the identity crisis that people talk about, or do you think it's made it so much worse?
So I think it has actually clarified the identity crisis. I think anyone who really follows knew it was there. And I think this election really is bringing it out to the forefront and putting it in the spotlight. I heard, and I don't have the figures exactly right, but in the Democratic caucus now you have, I think it was 90 members who are identifying as in the Progressive caucus, while 90 were identified as New Democrats, which is sort of your moderate caucus. Okay, right there you've got a split, 50-50, and it's going to be hard to start to address and figure out what's that big tent that includes, or is there a big tent? Is there a way to include your New Democrats, your moderates, along with those who self-identify as progressives? Will these new members have ways to talk to and address the indivisible movement and the resist movement, which really motivated the vote, right? That made a huge difference in terms of voter turnout. Is the party going to be able to help these candidates, many of whom are moderate, but who relied on that resist grassroots movement for their vote, their get out the vote and their voter turnout? How will that resolve itself? And does the party even have messaging to help those members address that big gulf and divide? And we will start to see that, and it will start to play out January, February. I mean, right now you'll just be focused on leadership election problems, which is yet another microcosm of the same divide.
So now, Jeanne, as far as the Republican Party, it seems to have gone in a different direction, which is that it's now it's Trump's party, and the kind of spread of ideology seems to have shrunk a bit. So what kind of lessons from the midterm do you see the party learning going forward and kind of just dealing with this situation?
Yeah, I don't know if I entirely agree with that. I mean, I was a little dismayed to hear Jeanne say that what the Republican Party is settled at this point. Maybe that's just my personal bias, because I truly hope it is not. It is not my flavor of Republicanism, if you will. But I do think, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on Republican candidates at all levels to sort of go along with what seems to be working. The president, won and continues to be actually more popular than probably a lot of people in this room would think he would be, given the way that he conducts himself. But I know that there are Republicans out there right now who are unhappy and who do blame him for these losses, and that feel that the state legislative chambers that have flipped. I've talked to people kind of out in the real world who say, we held on to these state legislative chambers, everything was going great, and the reason that we've lost them is Trump. Now, these aren't people that are, I don't think that's being said loudly, I don't think it's being said by a lot of people in Washington, but I would like to keep an eye on that and see whether it bubbles up and whether the party, whether there is a revolution, another revolution within the Republican Party. I mean, clearly we've gone through one already, but we could have another. I mean, Jeff Flake just said he may oppose him, Trump in a primary. Anything could happen. Again, maybe I'm a cockeyed optimist, but anything could happen.
Bob, how do you see that this could be addressed in 2020? Because obviously there is this sense that, Trump was great in some areas, but in general, it's a problem in others.
Well, what we learned when we came to power after 40 years in the wilderness in 1994 is that governing is hard. And the Democrats are about to find out now that governing is hard. Which means that for the Republicans in the House, they're going to be far more united than they've been for a long time. They can keep their people together on most issues. In the Senate, Mitch McConnell is going to have the ability to stop most legislation that endangers the president's program in coming over from the House. And so the Republicans are, looking out toward 2020, have a clear path for setting their own agenda now that they may not have had before. If Donald Trump runs for re-election, and I say if because I'm one of that small minority who believes that he may not run for re-election. He will certainly define the 2020 race, but if we are faced with an election where literally dozens of Democrats have chewed themselves up in the primary, he will stand a very good chance, I think, of being reelected.
If you wouldn't mind, Michelle, I'd love to add to something that Bob is pointing out here, which are the dynamics on the Hill that will occur with this shift, right? It's been a while. Republicans have had power for a while, and now they'll be in the minority. And I think they might experience pressure from their president if he wants to make deals with Democrats. Republicans could experience pressure from their leader to do things that they might not philosophically agree with. I mean, if President Trump wants to make a deal on health care or on infrastructure that involves a tremendous amount of spending, that increases the deficit, et cetera. These are things that there are plenty of real real conservatives in the House that, I'll say limited government conservatives, how about that? That it probably doesn't go along with their philosophy, but their president may pressure them to do it. I don't consider Donald Trump a Republican myself, so I think that he might do things that are non-Republican in an effort to make a deal with Nancy Pelosi. I think it could get really interesting, the dynamic between Republicans in the executive branch and the legislative branch. Do you guys think so?
I think you're absolutely right. That is a potential dynamic that we're going to face. The other dynamic is that, although I love this congressman more than anybody, I got to say, when you have a divided government like this, no one has to govern. It's like a free pass. The House can do whatever they want, knowing the Senate's not going to go along, and vice versa. And so I agree with you. Truly governing is hard, but nobody's responsible for governing right now, unless Trump decides that he wants to get something done. And, we have had such mixed reaction out of the White House on this midterm. I can't at all be predictive about what he's going to do. On the one hand, he, says he's vindicated, and then the next minute he says divided Congress can be a beautiful thing, and then next thing you know, he wants to burn the ballots in California and in Florida if he can get away with it. So we just don't know how, and he even said himself recently that if it comes out that the Republicans had lost the House, that he would just do what he always does. I'll figure it out. And I think what he is in the process of trying to do that, and doesn't know yet what to do. But I can see potential for a deal on infrastructure. I could see potential for a deal on the Dreamers. And I think Republicans beyond the White House understand that health care really turned on them as an issue, and some kind of action on that might be beneficial as well. But we may see the first test of all of this theory very soon, because the president today is endorsing legislation that includes prison reform and some sentencing reform. This is obviously something Jared Kushner's been pushing. It bends to the Democratic side. Sessions was hotly opposed to it. McConnell's going to have to bring it up in the Senate, and then House Republicans may deal with it as well. So we may see the very first testing of the new dynamics.
Well, this actually is what I wanted to bring up next, because, as you know, I think there's like a 4:30 event where the president is endorsing this plan. And Mitch McConnell had originally said he'd whip it, and if he had 60 votes, then he'd bring it up for a vote. But today, he's kind of backpedaling on that. He's like, well, maybe it's not as important as this or that or the other. You can hear the obstruction machine starting up again. And so I want to know, honestly, how optimistic are all of you that, knowing Mitch McConnell's approach to a lot of these things is to jam it up, is anything realistically going to get done, even with the president pressuring? I mean, McConnell has proved himself more than happy to stick his thumb in the president's eye when he feels like it. So, yes, infrastructure, these things would be great to move through, but realistically speaking, is there anything that you feel good about moving through?
I give 1%. Nothing's going to move.
And I tend to agree that I don't really think anything's going to move, and Bob said this as well. This is going to probably be a stuck time. And let's not forget how much effort, how many hours, how much human capital will be spent in this city launching investigations, sending subpoenas, and responding to it, right? So the legislative branch is, what did they call it this week? Axios reported this, that they're calling it the subpoena cannon, like the T-shirt cannon at a ball game. That's what the House Democrats are going to be launching at the executive branch. That's a lot of time that will be spent by people in the legislative and executive branches. I served in the George W. Bush administration at the Justice Department after Democrats took over the House in 2006, and let me tell you, things changed right quick for a politically appointed staffer at DOJ. Okay, the Attorney General was investigated nonstop. All of our jobs changed, frankly, and it was incredibly unproductive, and a lot of time and therefore taxpayer resources are wasted, in my opinion.
So how did? Go ahead.
So I was just going to say I agree with Jeanne's list of what could be bipartisan deals between the House and the President of infrastructure, health care, the Dreamers with border security, something like that. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the 1% might be generous. But I'm going to put out there that I think there are a couple of issues that are lurking where there could be some movement. And they're not the kind of issues that gain a lot of headlines, but they are fairly important. And one is going to be on omnibus privacy. And what are we going to do about data transfer and the whole sector of the data economy that is not currently under any regulatory structure except sort of this FTC jurisdiction. And then the other would be, I think, there's going to have to, of course, be some sort of budget deal for the next round of budget. And so something either very, dramatic or something just a roll out the same thing we've had is going to happen, and it'll carry something, because it always does. So I just want to put that out there for people, as there are going to be some of these pieces that are, it's not going to be an administration House deal, but instead these are the areas where you have bipartisan work going on in both the House and the Senate. They've not been partisan issues per se, but particularly on privacy. I mean, there is a commitment to continuing some of that examination and trying to figure out if they can move to a next step.
Well, that does...
Just one point. The one thing that is going to get done is that dozens of young conservatives are going to find themselves on the federal bench. There are all kinds of vacancies, and the Trump administration is going to find a lot of young conservatives and put them for lifetime appointments on the federal bench, and they're going to go through the Senate without any problem. And so that is going to get done.
And if you can't spend your time legislating, you have all the more time for confirming.
Sure, precisely. And the other thing I think you will see is if the Congress is tied up and is not able to move anything very much, you will see something which I regret, but nevertheless it has become a pattern, and that is lots more executive orders dealing with issues that are of importance to the administration.
Now, before we even get to the new Congress, as Jody knows, we have the budget battle coming up, and that means the wall battle, among other things. Any sense of how this is going to play out?
For a long time, we figured we were sort of counting on a government shutdown. It'd be relatively small because the Republicans in Congress didn't want to have a big shutdown fight in December, so they got as many pieces of the spending bills through. They've been done and signed. So there's a handful of departments that would shut down. Ironically, Department of Homeland Security would be one of them, so they'd be shutting down ICE, which they could use the law enforcement exemption, to keep those folks out there, but that would be one of the departments caught up in the fight. At this point, we are not, the Republicans on the Hill never wanted to have a shutdown fight, so there's no appetite for that up there. The president has repeated his demands for full funding for his wall. He repeated them all the way up to Election Day, but we have not heard him say that again post-Election Day. And so we don't have an indicator yet from where the White House is going to go on that.
Now, he seems to be nursing his wounds a bit. So there have been all kinds of stories in the last few days about kind of rage tweeting and unpleasant phone calls to, Theresa May and things like that. Obviously, after every election, you have a bit of reshuffling in the administration or whatever. But this seems to be to a different degree. I mean, for those who've been here a long time, is this something that you've seen before? Has it been surprising?
No, I think it's been fairly typical of what happens post-election as everybody tries to sort things out. I think what you need to remember about this administration, particularly this president, is he's a checklist president. He's gone down through and he's checked off tax bill, economic growth. Most of the agenda that he talked about in the campaign, he's now checked off. The one thing that he hasn't checked off, and the reason why he kept talking about it on the campaign trail, despite the fact that the Republicans in the Congress told him to get onto the economy, the thing he talked about was immigration. And the reason why he talked about immigration is because that's the main thing that he hasn't gotten done. And so my guess is that he is going to come back and he's going to continue to focus on that. And at some point he is going to veto a fairly big bill with the idea of trying to put that check mark on the list.
The irony here is that he had the deal. I mean, in January of last year, the Democrats gave him the wall. They gave him full funding of the wall, give us the Dreamers. He had the deal in front of him. And then it was actually Chief of Staff John Kelly and Stephen Miller who then stepped in the way of that deal and started adding lots and lots of things that, buried it because it couldn't take the weight of all of the other provisions. So there is a possibility that the Democrats would offer again the same deal. And one of the reasons they offered it, from what Nancy Pelosi has said, is that she'll give him the money for the wall because she doesn't think it's going to be built anyway. It's the environmentalists will go straight to court. Building a wall along parts of the southern border are simply impossible because of the geography that's down there. But he would get something built, and he'd get a picture in front of it, and he would check it off.
Right. No, I agree. I agree with you. And look, that's a deal that's been on the table for some time. That's the deal that can be had at almost any moment. And so I agree that really is one of the possibilities that rests out there, and it's literally the only one he cares about.
So now, one of the things that people are talking about, obviously, they're waiting on the Mueller report, which is kind of a wild card out there. But even before that happens, as we've been talking about, the Democratic House is just going to move in, and it's going to be oversight season. So, one, knowing what we know about this administration, how do we think it's going to be handled by the president? And two, what can Democrats do to avoid looking like they're overreaching? Because one of the challenges here is there's so very many things that potentially need a little probing, but if you start just even scratching the surface, it's automatically, just by sheer numbers, going to look like overreach.
I would love to share my executive branch experience perspective on that. Am I the only executive branch service person in the panel? Yeah. Okay, so what happens when you have the opposing party take over the House with the oversight responsibility is everybody is vulnerable except the president, right? I mean, because the Democrats in the House, they wanted, when I was in the Bush administration, they wanted to get at Bush, and they tried to get close to Bush through people like my boss at the Justice Department, Judge Gonzales. Gonzales was a very good friend of Bush, and they wanted to get him because he was so close to Bush. I always said if they had enough time, they would go after Margaret Spellings. They wanted Karl Rove. I mean, they want people close to the president. I think what will happen this time around will be even more so. The president gets protected, but this president is just... he'll just say, no, it's not true, I didn't do it, and walk away, and nothing will, he just has this bizarro ability to be like, that's not true, talk about something else, change the topic. So I think that I'm very worried, as someone who served in the executive branch, and I certainly have friends serving in this administration, I'm very worried about them, because their lives can really get ruined by this type. Their financial lives, they've got to hire lawyers to protect themselves. Whether or not you are innocent, the cost of being investigated is astounding. And again, I'll use my old boss, Judge Gonzales. This is a guy who was Attorney General of the United States, did nothing wrong. When investigations were done, he was completely exonerated. He could not get a job for a year or two after he left office. He could not be hired by any law firm in the United States. That is the damage that was done, and that is entirely political. He did nothing wrong. So people will go down, careers will be derailed, personal fortunes will be spent, debt will be incurred, and the guy over there will come out clean.
So you're saying the last 2 years are as calm as it gets? It's all downhill from here.
Oh my gosh! I always tell people.
Okay, just want everybody to know.
I served two terms in the Bush administration. That's where it gets even worse. If you go second term, where you sort of like lose steam anyway, and then an opposing party wins a branch of Congress, you're like, oh my God, never again. But that's what I think is going to happen.
All right, Jody, do you want to tackle the part about how do Democrats avoid?
So there is a way to avoid sort of this overreach and too much, right? It's a target-rich environment, and in that, if you really want clear messaging, you got to pick 2 targets and limit it. So if the Speaker of the House, whoever that may be, is smart, they're going to work with the chairman to focus on sort of the oversight on government agency, executive branch work, and if they decide they want it to go along with campaign finance and their ethics package, which they're going to move, which is which will not go anywhere, but they're going to work on, right? They will do that, and they'll focus on a couple of these agency heads who are clearly under investigation, even internally, by the inspector generals, and focus there. And then the other area will be sort of in this whole election interference, Robert Mueller arena, and there I do think they will be careful about not undermining the Mueller investigation, but I think that's sort of the other place where there'll be an investigation. Now, if they don't control it, it'll be a complete zoo, and it will, and that would be actually to the president's advantage, because there'll be too much news, and people's eyes will glaze over, which I think is in many ways what has happened in the last 2 years. You know, we have lost our sense of outrage around some of these activities or ethics or, you know, statements that are made, because there are so many of them. So if the Democrats are smart, they will take the message discipline they had during the election and apply it to how they handle investigations.
And my guess is you will also see some use of the Eric Holder precedent, where if Congress subpoenas you, you simply ignore the subpoena. And if they hold you in contempt, you simply ignore the fact that they held you in contempt. You know, my guess is that the administration will find that to be a very convenient tool in this. My
understanding is that if they ask for his tax returns, that's likely to just land everybody in court.
That could well be, but that will be a court case that will extend out to somewhere around 2050, would be my guess.
Yeah, exactly. So it could just drag on forever.
One of the things that I heard and I wonder about was when the president said, well, if they can do it, I can do it better. And that gets us to the question of what is going to be the mission of Whitaker at DOJ. Because they've already, with Congressman Nunes and the House chairman, the president obviously had a plan to get material that typically would never become public, but that he could get in selective ways to release and defend himself, or to spin news his way. And that's when he had only Mueller going after him. So it could turn into something we really haven't seen before. Well, sorry, that would be the Trump administration. but I just think it could escalate in ways that this country may not have seen before, and it might be really pretty scary. Going back to not the same crimes, but the kind of fevered pitch of the Watergate era, if it got there, but take impeachment off the table, because I think Nancy Pelosi is hell-bent. They're not going to make the mistakes of the 1990s. So it'll be that won't be there, but you could have the Congress investigating the administration and the administration trying to investigate Congress in some way.
Do any of you feel like there needs to be movement on the Protect Mueller push in Congress? Or, I mean, McConnell has not indicated that he is remotely open to this, but kind of what do you think needs to be done to safeguard
They have the legislation, and it passed the Judiciary Committee in the Senate on a bipartisan vote. It's sitting in Mitch McConnell's drawer. Senator Coons and Flake today putting pressure on McConnell to bring it up. He's not going to. Mm-hmm. And in part because he can, I think, fairly say Whitaker hasn't done anything. Or, back before he had visions of becoming AG, he said some things that probably he shouldn't have said, but that was before he knew anything real about the investigation, and certainly before he was Attorney General. So, but it does sit there in that drawer, and I think if we came to a real crisis, McConnell would pull it out.
You think?
Yeah.
You think it would come to that?
I tend to agree with that. And I want to, since we're talking about the law enforcement angle, I'd love to overlay one other observation from my time, particularly at DOJ. I was working in the public affairs office at the Justice Department, which, our job was to interact with the press. And we were considered quite a transparent office of public affairs. I think we were considered to work well with the press, especially when compared to actually the Obama administration following us. They were far less transparent with the reporters that covered DOJ. Now, all of that said, and we had some dramatic times when I was in that office, I read the news every day for more than a year with an insider's perspective of what might be in the news. And it never failed to amaze me how many things were missed in news stories. Not that they weren't paid attention to, but reporters literally could not know because information was classified or it was withheld to protect sources. When you talk about law enforcement and national security, there are so many things that reporters cannot know and cannot be told. It's just the way it is. And reporters still try to do a very good job of covering a story with all the pieces they have. I'm not faulting the press here. It's just one of these things that is what it is. So I encourage everybody who follows stories, whether it's the Mueller investigation, anything in that federal law enforcement space, always look at those stories with a grain of salt, because there are things that the reporter could not possibly know that could change the entire sort of shade of the story. So you guys are reporters too, so I want to hear your perspective on that. I mean, sometimes we find out things much later when they've been reported on, but the law enforcement piece, it is very difficult to have fully accurate reporting, and it's not the fault of the press. It's just the way it is.
I think the people on the Hill are fairly convinced that the Mueller investigation is close to being wrapped up, and they're not about to do something that changes the dynamic of that.
I think the Democrats are certainly committed not to do anything that's going to step on toes.
I don't hear anything among Republicans either that says that they're for changing the trajectory at this point. They think that it's going to be wrapped up. And we move on from there.
Yeah, it seems like there are a couple of things that need to happen before Mueller's done. We have Flynn has to be sentenced. Stone is probably going to be indicted, and we don't know what that is yet, and we don't know where and when, but clearly towards the end, what little we've been able to find out is this kind of furious activity around that particular question. Of course, the president, and Corsi, and of course the president, from what we understand, is soon going to send his answers. So Mueller, obviously would wait to see those things as well. So, I mean, the thing with, as hard as it is all the time, Jeanne, and I agree with you completely, with the Mueller investigation, it's the hardest thing of all, because they are nothing but a black hole.
They've been tight.
Absolutely,
I mean, this is
a
not
black hole.
And yet you're under pressure to write about it every day.
I know, it's made it hard when we have, like, Rudy Giuliani or some other representative of the White House come out and say, well, when I was talking to Mueller's people, yada, yada, yada. And then you go to Mueller's people and they won't say a word. So you don't know if they really had the conversation, and if they did have the conversation, did it really go like that? It's just been a very difficult thing to report on.
Now, here's kind of a just everyday operational kind of question. So we've already had a lot of churn in this White House, high rate of turnover among the cabinet. The word on the street is the Homeland Security Secretary is going, possibly John Kelly is going, Bolton's deputy's going. At what point does it become hard to run a government if you have all these vacancies and the spots behind them in some cases are vacant because they haven't been refilled? Is this normal?
No, it's not normal. And I thought too that all these announcements or leaks or whatever about these major changes at the top, that sounds to me more like a new administration, after what happens after a re-elect, not after a midterm election. And actually of real concern to Republicans in town from the beginning of this administration is the personnel process at the White House, and how many, many, many important positions under the cabinet level have not
which
been
you
filled,
don't hear
are
about,
persistently empty, and really do
issue.
affect the ability to get things done. Yeah, it's the personnel issue looks like a problem in the headlines. It's worse deeper down.
The personnel policies of this administration have been horrible, and they have not filled positions that should have been filled because they're important in terms of the overall policy objectives of the administration. Having said that, midterms are a place where people decide to leave. People who are unhappy decide to leave. People who don't think they have the support of the secretary decide to leave. I mean, there are lots of reasons for people leaving. The question will be how well the administration is able now to pick up and even put people into those positions as people go. And their record on that has not been particularly stellar.
I mean, the DHS seems to be a tricky one.
It's very problematic. I mean, she doesn't have a deputy. There are the two other high-ranking members. One of them's under investigation, and the other one's in a wing of this extremely large agency that doesn't exactly suit the role of secretary. So, I mean, in our reporting, what we've found is, the way we always kind of view it is that the president wants a Homeland Security Secretary who wakes up every single day thinking about the caravan and the border. And what do I do about that? But you talk to any experts, and they say we need a Homeland Security Secretary who wakes up every single day thinking about cyber. Mm-hmm. And that's where she has been. And so you just have two extremely different ways of looking at what this position is supposed to do. And obviously, ultimately, the president will prevail in getting someone in there who adopts his priority.
Her chief of staff is one of Jody and my former colleagues at Wexler Walker.
See, we should have all the inside.
He may be secretary material.
We'll talk later.
Right.
Okay, let me. Oh, yes, ma'am. We're gonna, in about a couple of minutes here, we'll switch and let you guys ask some questions. But before we do that, I wanted to just put this forward-looking one more time. Is there anything about the midterms, or what about the midterms, changed your view of what to look for heading into 2020 on either side?
Well, definitely it did. We've got so much more work to do in analyzing this. It just broke records on turnout. The turnout changed. The question of the blue wall. You had if you look at the trend of non-college educated white men and college educated women in the Trump era, they have done that. And that explains the suburbs. And then we had these weird counties, the one in South Carolina and then the seat in those two seats in Kansas. And so we took another measure, and that was college education or above. And that's where you saw the break. All of those districts are highly educated districts that flipped. So you have this sort of massive change going on where education, not just race or income, but education is becoming the breaking point. We haven't finished analyzing that. And then also, weirdly, you have Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the so-called blue wall. Democratic senators didn't just win, they cruised. They cruised to re-election in what were, the states where Trump won the White House. So we are trying to figure out what happened and, what's going on with those voters. And does that mean that is a persuadable area now? Is it kind of purple?
And what does this do to the Democratic primary, right? To the Democratic primary for president? How will all of this influence what Democrats choose for their candidate? Are they going to,
that's the other thing we have to take a look at. If you look at the Democratic primary, and Jody, you could talk to this as well, but they've changed the primary process in such dramatic ways that Iowa and New Hampshire become winnowing states, not winners. And then you go to Super Tuesday, and the black female voters that roll across the South that secured Hillary Clinton's victory for her. Bernie was chasing her after Super Tuesday. That was it. The game was over on that day. But at the same time, California they moved their primary all the way up. So you've got all kinds of weird points that are going to be moving at the same time. So who is the candidate that can survive Iowa and New Hampshire and appeal to the South and appeal to California? They're the two different wings of the party.
All right, does anybody want to make a prediction for who's going to do?
One other thing is the Republicans are going to have to figure out how to deal with the tsunami of money that came in through Act Blue. We didn't match that at all, and it was unbelievable. My old congressional district has not elected a Democrat since James Buchanan. And yet there was over $1 million, about $1.5 million that was poured by Democrats into that district. Now, why, I don't know. The Republican incumbent won by 16 points and so on, but there was just that kind of money in the system that the Republicans are going to have to figure out how to deal with.
And one more just data point that is a good one for all of us women to know is that overall, women obviously ran at record numbers, they won at good numbers, they're more diverse, everything, that there were more female campaign managers. I mean, it's kind of like at every level, women, Democrats and Republicans, got more involved. And one of those data points is that for the first time, donations from women exceeded $1 billion. The last time, it was just like crashes any record. So they're becoming donors too.
There's our silver lining. So, and with that, I think we should probably. Did anybody else want to jump in before I toss to the audience?
No, I'm happy to hear questions now.
You're happy?
Yeah.
All right, so I think somebody is floating. The woman in red right here. And I'll put on my glasses. There's a microphone coming to you.
Thanks, Edie Fraser. Just thank you for bringing up all the policy points, but also the women's points. Not only the $1 billion, but women were 59% to 59%, 47% in terms of the electorate on the Democrats and the suburban women. But we've now got 9 women governors, and we flipped the state legislators, right? We have 43,000 women that started to run from school boards all the way up. We're going to have 24% or 25% in the House, 23% in the Senate, and the minorities with African Americans, the first LGBTQ women, the first Muslim women. It is the new demographics of America. And what do you think isn't, and that's not going to stop. It started with the Women's March. And so don't you think that's going to have enormous impact?
So for 2020, you want to talk about the...
So I'll just say... Right. So there's no question that in this election, right, we saw a change in who was elected in that looks a lot more like the voters of America, right? More women, still not still not the same proportions as either women or minorities may make up in the population, but we saw a huge movement towards that. What kind of role does it play? It completely goes to Jeanne's point about what I call the crosstabs that we really haven't fully seen yet. Do these groups, are they turning out? Where are they living? Remember, we all live in much more segmented or gerrymandered ways. Not only do we have political gerrymandering, but people choose to live where there are other people very much like them, and that adds into that. And so we don't know. And remember, because of the way the Electoral College is set up, you really have a very, I will just say, an outsized impact of rural, older, white America when you look at a national vote. So the answer is, I haven't seen the data enough yet to make that analysis. It is the beginning of that. It is my hope, personally, that we will keep seeing that, no matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats, right, that we are seeing women step into leadership roles in elected positions and minorities, so that we are a much more diverse nation, not just in where we live, but in our policy, amongst our policymakers. So just that.
I believe that women have been observed to be, when legislators have been observed to be more of the deal makers or the working together across the aisle. I know I've read about this, but I don't have any pithy data points. But that could be an interesting effect. That we talk so much about how polarized, how divided the country is. I think that's the first thing I said up here today. And yet, with women coming along who are going to tend to work together, who knows? Maybe we see more of that.
One of the best examples of that, I thought, was McSally's concession.
Yes.
You know, you look at that, and you look at how
Rick Scott is having
Rick
a tantrum.
Scott is acting, and as some of the men are kind of going to warlike stances, and McSally was very graceful. And now, that said, that may be because Senator Kyle is going to leave his Arizona seat at the end of the year, and the talk is McSally will be appointed to that, so everybody's a winner in Arizona.
Everybody wins. Everybody wins. Right here.
Nancy Pelosi up or down, and how much of her problem is from her left, and how much of her problem is from her right?
Do you want to, Jody?
Okay. Pelosi's an up because they don't have any alternative, and the problem is equally from the left and the right.
There you go. You heard it. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Joan Michelson, Green Connections Media. Speaking of gerrymandering, in 2 years, that's going to be adjusted again. So how is that going to have an impact on 2020, if at all? I would imagine it would. And there's been so many lawsuits, some generated by Eric Holder's group and some, by others. But how is that? That's being reworked also, so it's not going to be static.
Yeah, the Democrats, obviously that was the mission, to try to flip some legislatures and get some governor's offices so that they wouldn't be so on their heels as they have been for the last 2 decade elections. The Republicans were much better about understanding this is about redistricting, and they went out and they won governors for that reason alone. And Democrats this time did better, got almost to parity. However, the courts are getting involved in ways we haven't seen them before. Even the U.S. Supreme Court is on, they've been tinkering with cases, where they take it, but then they really don't go as far as they could. But you can see there's something there in their calculation. And then you see Virginia, and you see Pennsylvania, and you see state courts getting involved. And then this past cycle, we had voters get involved and all the ballot initiatives that were aimed at trying to do something about gerrymandering. I think that the Democrats, I'm sure, are thrilled that they have those governorships, but I don't think it's going to, the old-fashioned way of doing things may not work everywhere, because you have more scrutiny from voters, more scrutiny from the courts. So, we still have cases out in North Carolina. So, I mean, it's, they were able to take these things back because the gerrymandered districts make it start to go purpley at the end of the decade because of movement by population. So they're really solid when they start, and by 2018, we're getting to the turn. Too many people have moved around. The suburbs went south for the Republicans in this cycle. So anyway, I mean, it's going to have a big impact, but I think it's going to be not as predictable as we might have said 10 years ago.
And the
judicial meander that took place in Pennsylvania really did impact the outcome of the election in Pennsylvania. And a good example of that is in a district that is just north of where I live that used to be represented by Charlie Dent. They had 2 elections at the same time with the same candidates. And the woman who was running in the district won for the upcoming Congress, but the man who was running in the district won in the old seat to fill out the rest of Charlie Dent's term, which will be about 3 weeks. But nevertheless, I mean, it was a demonstration of just how much the court changed the dynamic in Pennsylvania.
And the Democrats for H.R. 1 in the House. The Democrats' first big bill in the House is going to be their reform package, or at least this is their plan, certainly if Pelosi is Speaker. And part of that, they're interested in setting up a different system that wouldn't be quite so, biased. Now, as we've noted, nothing's going to necessarily go anywhere, but it is getting the issue. I think a lot more people are paying attention to this issue, so even if Congress can't manage to do anything, it does put it on states' radars. States can take actions. It winds up in the courts more. So I do think it has risen to the level where it will not be as it has been in the past. So I think that's true.
So predictions for 2020 for the Democrats, who are they going to nominate?
Or who's a horse that you like, even if you don't want to? It's like, who looks good to you?
Okay, you go ahead.
Well, in my view, they will end up nominating somebody who does not come out of the political establishment.
And
what's that?
Who is that?
Come on.
Well, I don't have a good name for you. I think that will be somebody. It'll be a business person. It will be a celebrity. It will be somebody outside the political establishment because
they want their own Trump.
Well, they don't want their own Trump, I don't think. But they want someone that has the same kind of image with the American people as a celebrity or as I say, a business.
Okay,
person.
now I started this thing telling you how much I love Bob Walker. Okay, but I want to know, when was the last time he went down to Georgia and talked to a Democratic primary voter? I don't think that's what they want. But the weird thing is, this is the kind of person that you have to think about. It's got to be the winner, right? They've got to be able to attract massive minority voting. They got to be liberal enough, progressive enough, because of the change in the primary, to appeal in California. They've never had to do that before. And they got to be tough enough that they can take 2 years of Donald Trump beating the crap out of them. And so who is that person? I mean, if you look at the Republican primary the last time, when you just look at the Trump effect, Jeb couldn't take it. Marco couldn't take it. I mean, these were stalwarts of the Republican Party, and he reduced them with his ability to bully. So what do we know about the Democrats? We know Elizabeth Warren can take it. She's taken it for 2 years. Can Kamala Harris? I don't know. Cory Booker? Yeah, he's kind of taken it. Cory Booker can appeal in the South and in California. He might, he's got some going on there. I cannot wait to go with Michael Bloomberg to Georgia. I mean, Bob Steyer in Louisiana. Come on, these are great visual images that are just weird.
And what, I'm not going to make a prediction, but I do think that just listening to you, you have to think about who's not going to run on the Democratic Party. I mean, you have congressmen no one have ever heard of coming out of the woodwork right now to announce, and that's before you get to Beto or the Castro brothers, or Seth Moulton's going to run, or maybe certainly Eric Swalwell's going to run. I mean, it's going to collapse the stage. Somebody joked that at the first debate they're going to have a kids' table for the kids' table. So there's a lot of winnowing that's going to occur, and it's going to get bloody and weird. So that's all I'm going to contribute. But
and I'm going to just say there are going to be a lot of candidates. It would not shock me if it's someone none of us have mentioned. But I do think but it will be in sort of a mix. I would actually look. It won't be Beto, I don't think, but look to someone who can speak like Beto to both the progressive and the moderate parts of the party. That is a unique capability he has.
And this is all assuming Oprah doesn't decide to run and just clear the field.
So, Jeanne Card, you've got to give us a name. Nobody's given us a name. You give us a name.
I'll give you a name. As I listened to Jeanne's test, I think there was a name that she left out. Who can take it? Bernie can take it.
There you go.
And he's in current polling. I think he was second. What I read today, it was like Biden is getting almost 30% and Bernie's getting 20%. He was second in line. I am a Vermonter myself. I've known of Bernie for a long time. So there you go, Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
They've got to find somebody less than 75 years old.
The only thing to note, it will be the aging tickets.
All right. Well,
and all New Yorkers.
We want to thank you, all of you, for being here. at various different levels, you've supported our organization, and coming here and giving these presentations is always a treat. So thanks again. All right.